Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. With us is Heather MacDonald. Heather MacDonald is a world-class conservative writer who thinks outside the box of conventional politics. In her best-selling book, The War on Cops, How the New Attack on Law and Order Makes Everyone Less Safe, she created a sensation, arguing that there is no institution more dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter than the police. In her latest book, The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture, she takes on affirmative action, challenges the nonsense premises of campus victimology as fraudulent, assaults the academy for adopting a formula for mediocrity, pleads poignantly for our colleges to return to the teaching of the Western canon of Shakespeare and Milton, Mozart and Michelangelo, and with laser beam accuracy takes a jackhammer to the diversity and sexist infrastructure prevalent in our universities. Heather MacDonald is controversial. She's been heckled, blocked, and booed and nearly assaulted on campuses where she has gone to speak. Her off-piste arguments are frequently misrepresented. Nevertheless, her positions are well-reasoned, polemical but thought-provoking, acerbic but crystal clear. She's a lawyer, a scholar, and an importantly deep thinker, and I'm pleased to welcome her to this table.
Well, thank you. That's such a wonderful introduction, and you've summarized my thinking better than I ever could.
Well,
so.
no, but I still need you to talk about it a little more.
Thank
But
you.
you write about victimology, and you yourself have been a victim on campus, haven't you?
Well,
Tell us about that.
I'm reluctant to use that language because I don't volunteer this, but if I ever am asked to talk about it, I'm accused of playing the victim card, which I really don't mean to do. But I was simply the target of the free speech zealots, the censors, the mob that were determined that anybody who's giving a different view on Black Lives Matter than the activists and the media should not be allowed on campus. I'd been invited to Claremont McKenna College, which is a small liberal arts college east of Los Angeles, to talk about the war on cops. And a plea went out on Facebook within like 48 hours of my arrival to block the fascist, white supremacist, homophobe, queerphobe, Islamophobe MacDonald. She shall not have a platform at Claremont McKenna.
Don't they believe in free speech in California?
They don't believe in free speech on most college campuses. And I think even the 60s free speech movement was probably, we took them at their word, which may have been a mistake, because even then Herbert Marcuse was talking about repressive tolerance, rather a non sequitur. But
well, you know, Justice Holmes and Schwimmer said free speech doesn't mean freedom for the ideas we agree with. It means freedom for the thought we hate. Hasn't they gotten through to students on our college campuses?
Well, it means that, and it also means freedom of thought for minorities, because traditionally, what amazes me about the ignorance of students in trying to suppress free speech, they don't understand that the power of censorship is traditionally used by authorities to suppress dissent, to suppress minorities. Frederick Douglass understood, he said that free speech, slavery could not tolerate free speech. For 5 years of its exercise would break every chain and auction block in the South. And these students who now control the levers of power to define hate speech are unable to abstract from their situation and understand that the precedent that they're creating of a right to silence unorthodox speech, if exercised by, say, their archenemy Donald Trump, would produce results that they would not agree with. So the historical ignorance and simply conceptual ignorance on the part of these student mobs is really quite extraordinary.
So, I mean, what about their rhetoric? It sounds so extreme and so absurd. They say, we're dying.
Yeah.
And they say that they need trigger warnings before they enter a classroom so they'll know if something is said that might be offensive. Or they need safe spaces where they'll have a feeling of comfort and stability. I mean, isn't all this patently ridiculous?
It's posturing. I frankly do not take the psychological claims at face value. I think this is a pretense. I think what's really going on here is an ideological war. On this, I differ with great respect with Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, who see this as largely a psychological phenomenon of overparenting. I don't think it works. That explanation matches the data too well. What this really is about, and again, let me just repeat, the maudlin, delusional, narcissistic rhetoric that is routinely put out by students on these campuses, students at Brown who occupied the president's office and said they should not have to be expected to attend to such ordinary expectations as going to class or studying for exams because they were working so hard to stay alive on Brown's campus. The Black Princeton students who's chanted, "We're sick and tired of being sick and tired," a phrase first uttered by Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights activist who was beaten for trying to vote in the 1950s. Fannie Lou Hamer.
Kind of misplaced at Princeton.
Misplaced.
$60,000 a year. Someone is.
Any Princeton student, I don't care if he's green, purple, or orange, who thinks of himself as oppressed is in the grip of a terrible delusion that will encumber him for the rest of his life.
Or my favorite is at Harvard Law School, the women who protested against the criminal law class because they taught the law of rape. And they thought they were entitled to a trigger warning as to what was going to be said about consent.
Well, yeah, and there's the so-called Socratic Method in law schools where teachers call students blind, you know, just without their asking question, and grill them about the cases that they were supposed to read for class that day. That method of teaching, which is august, which has been a way of training lawyers to think on their feet for centuries, is now almost in complete disuse because it is seen as too aggressive to females. These are the females who purport to want to be trial lawyers. Judges are not really yet, although who knows what's going to happen, are in the habit of issuing trigger warnings or being solicitous of females' delicate sensibilities.
So do you believe we're coddling our students too much, that in allowing them to give vent to these concerns? I mean, we could take a hard line. Administrators could take a hard line and say, if you want to stay here, you go to class and you stop agitating for this view or that view.
Well, coddling is, again, a word that I think is too much in the psychological realm, but I generally agree with what you said. I think that the role of adults is to teach young people to understand the difference between a real problem and a fake problem. The microaggressions that get proposed as sources of extraordinary threat to students' very lives.
Micro-racism is a buzzword that seems to be very much in vogue.
Yeah, it's
what
a
is
sign.
Micro-racism?
Micro-racism is racism invisible to the human eye. One of the favorite microaggressions that gets written on whiteboards by students making videos about their oppression that they hope will go viral on the web is one student asking another, "So, like, what are you?" Now, what this refers to is, in a world where we're supposed to think that somebody's ethnicity and race are the most important things about somebody's asking, "Okay, so you're Samoan, Japanese, Argentinian, what are you?" Maybe not the most apt phrasing, but literally harmless. And the adults should be telling students, do not let these perceived microaggressions get in the way of your ability to take advantage of the greatest thing that has ever been offered a human being, which is the opportunity for knowledge, the thing that Faust sold his soul for.
So your book tackles two subjects, among others, but primarily two subjects. One is affirmative action, and the other is sex. And affirmative action, so no one should mistake where you're coming from. You said recently, and I want to read it, at Harvard at the Harvard Club, at a speech at the Harvard Club, "The United States lived for centuries in grotesque violation of its most fundamental principles, without awareness of hypocrisy. It took decades to get over that. It is understandable to be skeptical that we have gotten past it." Do you think we've gotten past our history of racism in this country?
I think we're very largely past it. I don't know a single mainstream institution which is not twisting itself into knots to hire and promote as many blacks as possible. Certainly that is true on a college campus. To think that campuses are discriminating against blacks is ludicrous. Every single faculty search, every one, is a desperate struggle to find qualified blacks and females to hire. The problem is that there is an academic skills gap, and there are not blacks graduating in the fields that are seeking blacks in relevant numbers. For example, in 2016, there was one black PhD graduate in computer science in the whole country. Given that, it's nonsensical to think that the absence of black computer scientists in computer engineering departments and science departments at Brown, at UC Riverside, at SUNY Albany is a result of discrimination. There are no candidates to discriminate against. And what this is all about is not talking about the academic skills gap, which is vast, and is why now schools have for decades have been engaged in this extraordinarily destructive practice of using racial preferences to admit students who are not competitive academically with the students in the schools that they've been catapulted into. This is not to say that blacks shouldn't go to college, but every student should go to the college for which he is qualified. If MIT instituted gender preferences thinking we need more females in our undergraduate body and admitted me under a gender preference, and I had a math SAT of 650 on an 800-point scale, and all my peers had 800s, which is pretty much the reality at MIT, I would struggle in my first year. I would not be able to keep up with freshman calculus because it would be pitched rightly at the average level of my peers, and I would probably drop out or switch majors and decide to major in psychology or women's studies instead of pursuing an engineering degree. The same is true for blacks. Had I gone instead to Boston College, a perfectly respectable college, I'd be able to graduate with an engineering degree. So the use of preferences, whether it's gender preferences or race preferences, harms their alleged beneficiaries.
In the oral argument in the Fisher against Texas case, Justice Roberts made the, asked the rhetorical question, what unique perspective does a minority student bring to a physics class? Now, I assume you would endorse such a question.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Now, of course, teacher ed schools, which have been the source of so much nonsense in K through 12 education that, it's a two-way street between K through 12 and higher ed, they have been promoting the idea of multicultural math or multicultural physics, and we have this now with gender as well. This is all BS. If there was not an academic skills gap that needed to be explained away, nobody would be talking about multicultural math or physics. It's just a way of saying that somehow teaching math, teaching algebra is oppressive to minority students, and that's what explains the fact that maybe 10% in any given state of black high school students graduate proficient in math, as opposed to over 50% of whites and far higher among Asians.
But is the premise of Chief Justice Roberts' question really that minorities have to justify their presence in a math class or a science class in a way that's different from the way a white male has to justify his presence, simply on the basis of interest and achievement?
Well, I take his question to be saying race is irrelevant to the pursuit of science or physics. I don't think it's about justifying one's presence. I don't think anybody needs to justify his presence in the search for knowledge. That should be a passion that students have. But it helps to be in a classroom where your peers are at your own level of academic achievement, so that this the teaching is something that you are prepared for and ready to absorb. It is a handicap, it is a burden that we place on these beneficiaries of racial preferences to expect them to keep up, and they don't. I mean, the data is very clear. Richard Sander at UCLA Law School, who is a progressive, he has worked out the empirical consequences of racial preferences, and they're very disturbing.
Well, but what about the Princeton experience that very often, their experience has been that minority students in the early years don't do so well as the white males. But then as time proceeds over the 4 years of education, by the time they're finished, they're very competitive. And we've seen many instances of that. I mean, if you discount that, you're saying that education just is wasted on minorities.
No, absolutely. See, again, let me state this really clearly. I am not saying that minorities shouldn't go to college. I'm saying that every student should go to a college where his peers share his academic preparation. Again, it's not a race issue, it's a gender issue. If every female was catapulted into a school above her capacities, she would struggle. There's no shame. What I find so incredible about this discourse is the incredible elitism on the part of the most selective schools. The assumption is that unless you go to UC Berkeley, or unless you go to Princeton, or unless you go to Harvard, your career is over. You know, well, what about CUNY? There's no shame in attending a school that is not, where the Asians and whites are not at the 99th percentile. And I do not know about this principle. It is, in fact, not the case. There's a study at Duke that shows that, yes, the GPAs of black and white students at Duke, which start out very large in the freshman year, that gap closes by 50% over the 4 years. The reason why is that blacks attrit out of, they leave the science fields at enormous numbers.
But they may progress in other fields.
They go to black studies, that's right, that have less demands.
Not
so you can say they're
studies.
doing as well.
They might go to English or history or study music or any of the other
that would be fine.
fields that you're interested in.
That would be fine.
But let's just move on to sex for a moment, because you attack
much more interesting.
Much more interesting. You have attacked the so-called rape culture argument that exists on our campuses, that males are predatory and there have to be codes of conduct and there have to be Sanhedrins set up by the administration to try these cases of alleged sexual assault. Is that the total answer when you see situations like the one we saw at Dartmouth with 3 professors being sued by 7 women in the Department of Psychology and Brain Science for sexual harassment? Don't we need something to deal with a problem like that?
Well, that's sexual harassment in the workplace. I mean, that's a professor exploiting power, assuming that the allegations are true, and he denies it.
Well, the 3 of them, I guess they all deny it, but they all lost their tenure and they've all been disciplined by Dartmouth.
I take issue with the idea that undergraduates are at extraordinary risk from their fellow students of rape in numbers that are unheard of. I mean, the campus rape industry's 1 in 4, 1 in 5 alleged ratio of sexual assault is higher than, we see in African civil wars, where sex and rape are used as tools of warfare. If that were the case, if colleges were this extraordinary, unprecedented scene of the most violent crime short of murder that a female can experience, I assume that females are wise enough and self-protective enough to have started a stampede decades ago to create single-sex schools where they could study in safety. I assume that mothers, well-educated, highly educated baby boomer, Gen X, millennial mothers would not be shoveling their daughters into these maelstroms of sexual violence, but instead would be demanding that either, at the very least, that schools radically revamp their admissions policies that are letting in all these alleged rapists, or again, would demand single-sex schools. I also assume we're supposed to believe that females are strong females together, that they look out for themselves and that they're smart, that they would know enough if frat parties are scenes of gang rape to avoid them.
How about alcohol? Most of the use of alcohol on our college campuses is illegal because the consumers are underage. But in your book, you really aren't critical of the abuse of alcohol on campuses. You say there were drunken sex parties, hookup parties, but you take it as a given that they're going to drink. Why isn't it given that they're going to have sex?
Well, I'm not celebratory of alcohol. I don't, by all means, let the campuses exercise some parietal oversight for once and ban it. But I do think that it is possible to avoid what is being termed campus rape, for a female to avoid it by taking a few simple steps. Don't drink yourself blotto. The girls are drinking themselves blotto precisely to lower their sexual inhibitions. They know what's coming, and they want to be free to do it. Don't drink yourself blotto. Don't get into a bed with a guy you barely know, and don't take off your clothes. You are setting in place and sending signals that are hard to stop. Should you be able to stop it at a moment's notice? Of course. But if you want to really avoid any possibility, just don't do it. Just as the same, I'm not particularly sympathetic, frankly, to the guys who have been falsely accused of campus rape, because they too have it within their power to avoid false rape allegations by walking their girlfriend home at night, kissing her goodnight, and writing a love poem to her at 3 a.m., rather than taking advantage of this boorish, promiscuous college hookup scene. But what I find most curious is when I ask the campus rape advisors, which is a massive bureaucracy now, why don't you send a simple message of personal responsibility to females? If you believe that they are at risk of this extraordinarily traumatic experience, why not offer some advice that will keep them out of danger's way?
Well,
and they say, no, I will never do that because I don't want to suggest that rape is ever the victim's fault. This isn't a question of assigning blame and innocence. It's about protecting females. That should be their primary focus. If they really care about protecting females, they would say, don't drink at these parties and get into bed with a guy you don't know. They will not send that message. Why? Because they don't really believe it's, either they don't really believe it's rape, or they'd rather put up with rape in order to preserve the principle of male fault. And to me, that is extraordinarily vicious and unthinking on their parts.
Well, doesn't it stand feminism on its head? Because when the feminist movement started, I thought what it was all about is women have to take responsibility for their own happiness and their own future and their own conduct.
Right.
Now they're saying it's the woman need not take responsibility, it's the man's responsibility. And
go figure. It's absolutely, it's a rebirth of neo-Victorianism. I think it's sexual liberation is having a nervous breakdown on college campuses. It turns out that the fundamental premises of sexual liberation were wrong. Males and females are not equal in their libidos. They do not desire and react to casual, promiscuous one-night stands the same way. Women have more emotional connection, more of an emotional response to sex. Rather than saying, you know what, this isn't working out so well for females emotionally. They see the guy they just slept with going to classes and he seems completely unaffected by it. You know, maybe she lost her virginity. This has profound emotional consequences. Rather than saying, you know, maybe we should go back to the default for premarital sex was no, which gave females power. They didn't have to negotiate a no every time. The default was no, and a female could lift that default and say yes. Now, thanks to sexual liberation, the default for premarital casual sex is yes. And a female has to bargain her way into a no. And they find themselves up against the male libido. They're going mano a mano with it, and it's not an equal battle. And a lot of females, you know, this is not me speaking. You can go to blogs of, you know, empowered females, and they talk about the fact that it's just easier to say yes. So I didn't want to have sex, but I didn't want to have to argue with the guy, so I had sex.
Didn't want to argue with the guy. So I have a question for you, Heather MacDonald. This has been fascinating. And my question is obsession with diversity in sex corrupting our culture?
It's certainly taking us away from more important things to think about, yes.
Taking us away from more important things to think about. Thank you so much for coming by. This has been wonderful, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.